You're listening to a sound that's been heard on the streets of our city for nearly half a century. Boston's own unique hurdy-gurdy man, Marino Persicchini. Boston, sometimes called the hub of the universe, has many sounds. Sounds which speak of the past, the present, and the future. For Boston is a city of contrast, a city of character, a city steeped in heritage and history, rich in culture, a city where carefully preserved historical shrines sit with quiet dignity in the tolerant shade of modern skyscrapers. Skyscrapers similar to those under construction right now at the new Prudential Center in the Back Bay section on a vast 31-acre plot of land. The construction sounds you hear in the background herald the 52-story Prudential Tower. Also, the world's newest hotel, to be operated by the Hotel Corporation of America, a convention hall, a $12 million auditorium, a huge complex of high-rise apartment houses and office buildings. This and other great new projects have been advanced by the interest and active encouragement of a forward-looking mayor and city council. Boston, in spite of its historical significance, is a city taking giant steps into the future. Elsewhere in the Boston area, you'll hear other sounds of the modern world. At Logan Airport, just a few minutes from downtown center, a streamlined jet warms up prior to sweeping down the world's longest commercial runway. The hub is densely populated with schools and universities. There are over 500 within a 5-mile radius. Schools and colleges known throughout the world. Boston University, where these football cheers were recorded. Massachusetts Institute of Technology, home of complicated computers which speak in a mechanical language all their own. Other famous institutions, such as Burdett College, Simmons, Boston College, Harvard University, Wellesley, Radcliffe, Brandeis, Wentworth Institute, Tufts, and Northeastern University, are a steadily enriching force in the community. The reputations of Boston's educational institutions are a magnet for foreign students, attracting 4% of all the foreign undergraduates in the nation and 7% of the graduate students. Bostonians know how to enjoy life, too. Whether it's sitting on the breeze-swept banks of the Charles River on a summer's night, listening to the Boston Pops Orchestra offering free concerts at the Hatch Memorial Shell on the Esplanade, or rooting the Red Sox on to victory at Fenway Park. For the children, grown-ups too, the animals out at Franklin Park Zoo, New England's largest, sound off in their own way. Yes, there are many sounds to hear in Boston, and there are many sights to see. So let's climb aboard our luxurious Gray Line bus, settle back comfortably, and let our Gray Line driver, Bill Dowling, take us on a tour of this fascinating city.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We of the Gray Line here in Boston would like to welcome you here to our city. Now, this old city of ours was established as a Puritan settlement in 1630, and it's steeped in the history and tradition of the founding fathers. the fight for liberty, the American Revolution, and has become one of the great scientific and cultural centers of the world.
Our tour begins in Copley Square, where all Gray Line tours start. To our right is the Sheraton Plaza Hotel, one of the city's finest. The Sheraton is also the home office of the Gray Line here in Boston. This picturesque square was named in honor of John Singleton Copley, a noted portrait painter who resided in the city during colonial times. He painted portraits of such famous people as George and Martha Washington and Paul Revere. No other square in the United States offers such wonderful examples of architecture. Directly ahead of us is Trinity Episcopal Church of French Romanesque architecture. Behind us and to the left is a good example of Italian Gothic architecture in the new Old South Church. Directly behind us is an example of Renaissance architecture in the Boston Public Library. The Boston Public Library was America's first free library and dates back to 1875.
As we leave Copley Square, we continue along Boylston Street, named for Dr. Zebediah Boylston. This early Boston physician in 1711 pioneered the inoculation principle for the cure and abolition of smallpox. The light granite building to our left houses America's oldest mutual life insurance company, the New England Mutual. They received their charter to write insurance on the mutual basis in 1835.
Boylston Street is to Boston what Fifth Avenue is to New York. It is, as you'll see, the location of many of the better specialty shops. Since it serves as the marketplace for all New England, Boston has a broad variety of specialized and general retail market areas. The Central Shopping District alone has over 9,000 retail establishments. As we proceed along busy Boylston Street, we approach the garden spot of downtown Boston, the Boston Public Garden. Its 24.5 acres of land are devoted to beautifully kept floral displays. In the center of the garden is the famous Swan Pond, spanned at its narrowest point by our little Bridge of Sighs. The swan boats are an institution here in the hub. They've been operated now by one family through 4 generations, and each summer thousands of youngsters delight in the delicate sound of the water swishing quietly beneath the pedal-propelled boats. The Boston Public Garden is known especially for its beautiful floral displays, and every spring the tulip beds are breathtaking with over 5,000 bulbs in bloom. Each year, the now famous Boston Arts Festival is held in the garden and attracts thousands of art lovers. The City of Boston Park Department takes great pride in the garden and takes pains to see that it is properly maintained. Another agency, the Metropolitan District Commission, has charge of several equally impressive parks in the greater Boston area.
Now, as we enter Charles Street, the park area to your right is that of America's oldest public park, the Boston Common. The Common as such dates back to the year 1634. That was the year in which Governor Winthrop, the second governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, purchased this 48.5 acre tract of land from Boston's settler, the religious hermit, the Reverend William Blackston, and gave the land to the people. In doing so, he stipulated that there were never to be any public buildings erected upon it or streets cut through it, but that it was to be used forevermore as a common meeting place, common exercise and training field for the militia, and a common grazing ground for the people.
Once a year, during National Dairy Week, cows are again allowed to graze on the Common. It's a peculiar sight to see, too, cows on Boston Common in the 20th century. They're housed in large tents, but listening to them, you have the feeling they'd much rather be back on the farm. A more familiar sight on the Common are the friendly, forever hungry pigeons that congregate and coo in appreciation whenever peanuts or popcorn is offered. Undisturbed by the activity outside, Boston's well-known subway system, the first built in this country, and now operated by the Metropolitan Transit Authority, runs on schedule, carrying thousands of commuters to their destinations every day.
along, you'll notice that there are entrance and exit ramps here along the side of the common. At the end of 1961, there was completed here beneath the common a huge underground parking garage. Accommodating close to 2,000 cars, it was built by an authority for the city hoping to alleviate to a certain degree our tremendous parking problem. Typical, of course, of all of the major cities throughout the nation.
As we turn right onto Beacon Street, you can see the celebrated Soldier and Sailors Monument. Beacon Street and Beacon Hill, as you know, have been traditionally the location of townhouses for Boston's aristocracy. Note the graceful colonial doorways, the grillwork balconies of the homes here on Beacon Hill. In these first two on your left, you'll notice the panes of glass in the windows are different colors, some amber, some lavender, and some a slightly greener shade. These are the well-known stained glass windows of Beacon Hill. Actually, the glass isn't tinted or stained at all. The colors are the result of a chemical change within the glass itself, caused by the rays of the sun over a period of years.
Now, of the 13 colonial states that ratified the Constitution, only 2 maintain their original Capitol buildings. They are the Commonwealth of Massachusetts and the state of Maryland. To our left now is the very imposing Capitol building of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. This is not the original. We'll see the original in a few minutes. However, our present Capitol building is far from brand new. The red center section was dedicated in 1797. The granite wings added in 1916. The center section was designed by Charles Bulfinch, the noted colonial post-Revolutionary War architect, who also helped to design the Capitol building in the District of Columbia. On that red center section, there was originally a church-like steeple. That was taken down in 1802, rounded off in a wooden dome, and sheathed in copper by Paul Revere and his eldest son, Joseph. They were operating the Revere rolling mills out in Canton, Massachusetts at that time. It was later rebuilt and gilt in 24-karat gold leaf as you see it today.
Among the statues in front of the Capitol building are those of Horace Mann, the great educator and philosopher, Daniel Webster, one of America's greatest orators, and the equestrian statue of General Joseph Hooker of Civil War fame. If you were to enter the Capitol building, you'd see hanging above you the sacred codfish of Massachusetts, symbol of the fishing industry upon which the economy of the Commonwealth was dependent in the early days.
Now we begin to leave the planned part of the city of Boston. It's possible that you noticed that the Back Bay section of our city was planned along the grid system, square blocks, straight streets. We now enter Old Boston, known for its narrow, crooked, winding little streets. And at this point, as we move down Beacon Street, Beacon will suddenly become School Street. The brownstone building to our right is that of America's oldest and largest private library, the Boston Athenaeum. The Athenaeum is maintained by 1,049 shareholders. They're called proprietors. Back many years ago, it was a meeting place for the literary and intellectual minds of Boston, and the building contains a wealth of first editions and very, very rare books. And now as we approach the intersection of School and Tremont Streets, on the far left-hand corner is one of the many old churches that we will pass today, Old King's Chapel. This is the second of 2 structures that have stood on this same site. The original King's Chapel was constructed on this site of wood in 1689. The present granite structure dated 1749. The interior of the church remains pretty much the same as it was back in the old wooden church constructed in 1689. This was the first Episcopal church in Boston, but in the early 1800s became a Unitarian church and is still an active Unitarian church.
Services are still conducted at King's Chapel every Sunday. The King's Chapel bell, which was cast by Paul Revere, is the same one which tolled at Revere's funeral at his request. Each Sunday prior to the services, The King's Chapel bell may be heard throughout the entire neighborhood.
On the far right-hand corner of the intersection is Boston's Parker House. This is the oldest hotel name in Boston. We've had a Parker House here in Boston ever since the late 1600s, when John Parker constructed his first inn.
And it was in the kitchen of the Parker House that what has become a famous piece of American pastry was first baked, the well-known Parker House roll. As we continue along School Street, we pass Boston City Hall on our left. Now, this building will soon be replaced by a modern high-rise structure. The statues in front are of Benjamin Franklin, who was born and brought up here before going to Philadelphia, and Josiah Quincy, the leading political figure of the colonial period.
Now, as we approach the intersection of School and Washington Streets, the last building on the left-hand side is of the Old Corner Bookstore. The Old Corner Bookstore building, dating back to 1712, was a bookstore frequented by many of the literary lights of the national period in the middle 1800s. And as we make the left turn onto Washington Street, there stands to your right an old red brick church, the Old South Meeting House, which was consecrated in 1729.
It was here, on the night of December 16th, 1773, that a group of the Sons of Liberty gathered and partially disguised themselves as Mohawk Indians. They slipped down to Boston Harbor, boarded 3 British ships at Griffin's Wharf, and proceeded to pour 342 cases of Her Majesty's tea into the ocean. This, of course, was the renowned Boston Tea Party. Now, we're in the financial district, where the steady hum of modern business machines indicates great activity. Virtually every dollar spent in New England passes through Boston at some time. As District 1 headquarters of the Federal Reserve System, the city has financial facilities, services, and skills which compare favorably to those of any other area in the United States. On our right is the Federal Building. To our left is the home office of the National Shawmut Bank. Shawmut, incidentally, was the first name for Boston given to the settlement by the Indians. In their language, it means the place of living springs. We're passing the spot where the Puritans established their first camp in 1630, moving quickly along Congress Street now. To our left is the original Capitol building of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Constructed in 1713, this old American public building still bears the symbol of British sovereignty, the golden lion and the unicorn. On July 18, 1775, from the little balcony on this building, the Declaration of Independence was first read to the people of the new nation. To our left in the pavement there is a circular cobblestone plaque. It marks the site of the Boston Massacre. This historic event took place on March 5, 1770, when a mob of people assembled to voice their protest against the writs of assistance and the Stamp Act. The building at that time was the headquarters of the British Governor-General. The crowd became unruly. The captain of the guard ordered his men to press forward to contain the crowd. The mob became even more aggressive. The captain ordered his men to fire. 5 people were killed. This was one of the major incidents which led to the American Revolution.
As we enter Dock Square, statue dominating Dock Square is that of Samuel Adams, one of the fathers of American liberty, signer of the Declaration of Independence. Directly behind Samuel Adams is Faneuil Hall, called by James Otis the cradle of American liberty. It was in this building that the rebellion element held many of their very important secret and fiery meetings. Organizations like the Committee for Safety, Sons of Liberty, Committee of Mechanics, and Committee of Correspondence made plans for protest demonstrations, for marches to the Liberty Tree, for refusal to pay certain taxes, for arming and enlarging the militia. Now, Peter Faneuil, a very wealthy Boston merchant, gave the building to the people of Boston in 1757, asking that as long as the building stood, for the bottom floor to be used as a public market. It's still a public market today. The second floor is a free meeting hall for the people, and the third floor the headquarters of the Ancient and Honorable Artillery, America's oldest civil military organization.
On top of the gold dome which crowns Faneuil Hall, the unique grasshopper weather vane has quietly watched the progress of Boston and the events of the day for nearly 2.5 centuries.
Hey, who wants an oven ready turkey? Get your turkey!
Faneuil Hall is located right in the heart of the market district. The streets outside are generally a maze of traffic and confusion. Peddlers shout their wares. Traffic threads its way through the shopping crowds. Inside Faneuil Hall, there is a restful silence, broken only by the sweet song of the Faneuil Hall Westminster chime, which strikes on the hour every hour.
Now, as we pass beneath the John F. Fitzgerald Expressway, part of our central artery system, to our right front is the entrance to the Callahan Tunnel. To our left front, the exit, the Sumner Tunnel. These two tunnels transport traffic to and from Boston beneath Boston Harbor about 1.1 miles. They link the north end of the city of Boston with the East Boston section. And this is the north end of our city.
The North End is one of the oldest inhabited sections of Boston. Located in Little North Square is the city's most ancient wooden building, the home of Paul Revere. This is the first stop our Gray Line bus makes, and we'll be given a chance to stretch our legs and take a leisurely look at this historical shrine.
Good afternoon, folks. We're glad to greet you here at the Paul Revere House. We assume that people visiting the house know who Paul Revere was and about some of the things that he did. But things are well marked here in the house. We allow people to browse around to suit themselves, and we'll very gladly answer any questions that you might have.
Paul Revere lived in this house from 1770 to 1800. He was a remarkable man, this patriot, Paul Revere. In addition to his famous midnight ride, he was a colonel in the Continental Army, a metalsmith, a tinsmith, a coppersmith, and a goldsmith, also an engraver. He cut the engravings used to print the first United States currency, and he also made false teeth. Besides all this activity, he found time to raise 16 children. And if you stand in the living room of this tiny four-room house, you can hear footsteps in the bedroom overhead in much the same way as Paul Revere must have heard them when he lived here. As you leave this house at 19 North Square, this house of leaded, diamond-shaped windows, colonial moldings, and antique furnishings, a carefully preserved monument to a man who by his own hard work became a clever craftsman and a successful businessman, yet was ready to risk all this in his patriotism, you begin to realize why Boston is so proud of the part she played in the birth of this nation. It's time to move along now, but there are many more places to see before our tour is ended. We move down Prince Street, barely negotiating the narrow, winding turns. Turning right on Hanover Street, we approach another of the historic monuments of which Bostonians are justifiably proud. Our Gray Line driver describes an event that's familiar to every schoolboy in America.
As we dwell on Paul Revere's ride on the night of the 18th of April in 1775, we recall that his ride was touched off by signal lanterns shown in the steeple of the Old North Church. Lanterns hung by Sexton Robert Newman. The famous signal, "Oneth by land, twoeth by sea." The Old North Church is Christ Church Episcopal. built in 1723. It was a church attended by many of the leading lights of early Boston, and is today an active Episcopal congregation. In the Old North Church is the oldest pipe organ in America. As you look at the Old North Church, you notice its beautiful steeple. This is the third of three steeples. The last one, you might recall, reading in your hometown newspapers, fell a victim to Hurricane Carol in 1955. This present steeple, constructed with funds derived of contributions made from all over the free world.
Outside the steeple on the Paul Revere Mall, frolicking children play around the base of his statue. While inside the steeple, and still in use today, are the old bells which rang out in 1781 with the joyous news of Cornwallis's surrender at Yorktown. Our next stop, here at the head of Hanover Street, is the Constitution Wharf, the Coast Guard base at Boston's Inner Harbor, Lightship Service Base, and headquarters of the Commandant of the 1st Coast Guard District. Constitution Wharf stands on the site of the old Hart Shipyard, where the USS Constitution, better known as Old Ironsides, was built in 1797. Now we're entering a street with a rather odd distinction. It begins as Commercial Street. As it winds along the waterfront, its name changes, for no particular reason, 3 times. Further along, it becomes, rather logically, Atlantic Avenue. You could spend a whole day in the waterfront area and still not see everything there is to see, nor hear everything there is to hear. In the distance, when the wind is just right, you can hear bellboys and ships' whistles. Fishing boat engines and horns add their voices to the hum of activity as dozens of sturdy small craft set out for the Grand Banks or return, their bright pennants proclaiming a full catch. Everywhere you turn, there are things to see, sounds to hear. At nearby Union Oyster House, you can hear the juicy sound of oysters being opened. And overriding all the sounds of this bustling seaport are the carping, querulous cries of the ever-present, always hungry seagulls that wheel and circle overhead in a never-ending search for food. Continuing along towards our next point of interest, the myriad waterfront smells still lingering in our nostrils, we pass a large stone embattlement. Our lecturer informs us this was once a British Revolutionary fort. The hill where it stood, Copp's Hill, is one of the 3 hills which made up the original settlement of Boston. It was at this fort the British set up the cannon used to shell the Americans during the Battle of Bunker Hill. The city's second oldest burial ground is located atop Copp's Hill, and the earliest stone there dates back to April of 1661. Now, our driver-lecturer swings to the right, and we proceed across one of Boston's many bridges. Looking off to the right, we can see our next stopping place, the Charlestown Navy Yard. Minutes later, we pull into a neatly kept parking area and catch our first glimpse of that grand old fighting ship, the U.S. frigate Constitution. Still commissioned, but out of action now, Old Ironsides floats proudly within sight of newer, more modern fighting ships. Before we board this majestic vessel, our driver warns us to be careful of the steep ladders leading below decks. As we step aboard and stand on a deck that once resounded with the din of battle, we're greeted by the ship's bell.
Now, the Constitution, or Old Ironsides, was constructed and commissioned in 1797. Commissioned on October the 21st, first saw action against the Tripoli and Barbary pirates, then in the War of 1812, and was used as a school ship during the Civil War. And her record is an unblemished one. In over 40 individual engagements, she never saw defeat. At the present time, she's the flagship of the Admiral in command of the 1st Naval District.
Much of her original wood has been replaced, but she still looks as she did in the days of wooden ships and iron men. The Constitution was restored with money collected in schools all over the nation. She hasn't been under sail since 1881, but on 2 occasions was towed by naval tugs to every major port on the Atlantic, Gulf, and Pacific coasts, as well as up the Mississippi to inland ports. Her carefully kept ship's log attests to the fact that millions of visitors from all walks of life have come to pay their respects to this gallant fighting ship that played such a large role in the hard-won battle for our freedom. We'll have to move along quickly now, for there are still many places to visit. But before we leave, let's ring once more the ship's bell. We're off again. Our next point of interest, the Bunker Hill Monument, located atop Breed's Hill in Charlestown. As our guide colorfully describes this historical landmark, we learn that, contrary to popular belief, the Battle of Bunker Hill did not take place on Bunker Hill at all, but here on Breed's Hill. The mix-up occurred when Colonel William Prescott was ordered by the Committee for Safety to fortify Bunker Hill. After reconnaissance, however, he found that it was far more practical to fortify Breed's Hill, and he did so without informing his superiors. On the morning of the 17th of June, 1775, a force of over 1,700 British troops massed at the foot of the hill, formed their lines and began their assault. By sheer force of numbers, the British stormed the redoubt, and a fierce hand-to-hand battle took place, with musket butts, swords, rocks, sticks, anything. The courageous patriots fought desperately until finally, after dark, they were driven from the hill. The British lost nearly 50% of their attacking force, the Americans about 25%. Out of that battle came the famous words, "Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes." Listen as our driver describes this towering monument to American courage and determination.
Now, the monument itself is of native Quincy granite construction. It's a perfect obelisk, 30 feet square at the base, tapering to 15 feet at the top, 221 feet in height. It was completed and dedicated in 1846, and there is no elevator. 294 winding stairs inside to the top.
294 winding stairs, a long, hard climb to the top. But once there, the view is worth it. It's been said that it takes 10 minutes to make the climb, and 2 weeks to recover from it. Leaving Bunker Hill, we pass a small park on our left, the Charlestown Training Field, or Common. Each city, town, hamlet, and village in New England has a common, or plot of ground, set aside in colonial times for common usage. Our Gray Line bus carries us smoothly over a modern expressway, and we re-enter Boston proper. We're coming into an area now that's equally confusing to visitor and Bostonian alike. Haymarket Square, just one of the many traffic hubs that dot the city. 7 streets, resembling the spokes of a wheel, radiate from its center. We head up Sudbury Street and another traffic hub. This one is famous the world over.
This one, for many years, was one of the art and culture centers of the city, Scully Square. Of course, that all depends on what you recognize as art and what degree of perfection the culture's attained, but Scully Square for years has been a meeting place for sailors.
Scully Square, once the home of bright lights, loud music, tattoo parlors, gaudy souvenir shops, peep shows, and penny arcades. But now, the music has been replaced by another sound. For Scully Square is undergoing a gigantic facelifting. Caught in the machinery of progress, the tattoo parlors and honky-tonks are being replaced by a soaring, multi-million-dollar government center.
As we move through Scully Square, to our left you notice hanging over the door of the old Oriental Tea Company a big copper tea kettle. The steam coming out the spout signifies that the establishment is open for business. Boston has been historically a center in the tea and spice trade, and it's the tea city of America today. There's more tea consumed here than any other major city in the country per capita. The reasons being, of course, the traditional English and Irish influences.
Leaving Scully Square with its memories of a bygone era, we enter Tremont Street. As we pass number 14, our lecturer informs us that here, in a small office, Dr. Morton conducted many of the experiments that led to the use of ether as an anesthetic. He was later credited with using it successfully in surgery for the first time in an operation performed at Massachusetts General Hospital.
To our left now on Tremont Street is the oldest burial ground in Boston, the Old King's Chapel burial ground. The earliest stone dates back to March of 1630. That's as old as the city itself. Governor Winthrop, the man that gave the common to the people, is buried here. Mary Chilton, according to story, the first woman of the Pilgrim group to step foot on the soil of the New World, is buried here. Sir Isaac Johnson, the man that named this settlement of Boston, and Colonel William Dawes, Paul Revere's co-writer, are all laid away here in the old granary burial ground. Alongside the Parker House building is the Tremont Temple Baptist Church. For many years, this was the largest indoor auditorium in the city, and it was here in the Tremont Temple Baptist Church that P.T. Barnum presented for the first time to the people of this nation the tremendous talents of the Swedish Nightingale, Jenny Lind.
To our right is another of the many old burial grounds located in Boston, the Granary Burial Ground. Samuel Adams, Robert Treat Paine, and John Hancock, all signers of the Declaration, are laid to rest in this quiet cemetery. Also to be found here are the graves of the 5 victims of the Boston Massacre, the parents of Benjamin Franklin, Paul Revere, James Otis, and the first mayor of Boston, John Phillips. Mary Goss, or as she was later to become known, Mother Goose, is buried here. What child is not delighted in the stories of this woman who lived in Boston many years ago? A woman who had no children of her own, but possessed a personal magnetism that attracted them to her. Her wonderful flair for rhyme and her vivid imagination took form in the stories that have become familiar to children throughout the world. Beside the old Granary Burial Ground is Park Street Congregational Church, constructed in 1809, whose steeple bell you hear in the background. This church has been called the Brimstone Church because it was used for the storage of munitions, powder, and brimstone during the War of 1812. In colonial times, Puritan preachers presented their sermons from the little balcony on the side of the church. William Lloyd Garrison gave many of his fiery abolitionist speeches from that balcony. It was also here that the patriotic anthem, "My Country 'Tis of Thee," was heard for the first time, sung by a group of Boston schoolchildren on July 4th, 1848.
We are, as you notice, passing down the other side of the common. This broad walk along the common is known as the Marquis de Lafayette Mall. It was named for Lafayette in 1826, when he revisited this country after being released from prison in France. Just one block over to our left is Washington Street. Washington Street is the longest and crookedest street in New England. The street runs a distance of 44 miles from Boston to Pawtucket, Rhode Island, and it's Washington Street all the way.
As our driver skillfully threads his way through the heavy traffic of Tremont Street, he points out the building that now stands where the Liberty Tree of Revolutionary times once stood. Back in the 1770s, the citizens of Boston rallied around the tree and held many of their protest meetings against what they considered ill treatment by the British administration. We reach the intersection of Boylston and Tremont Streets. On the far left-hand corner, occupying what was once the site of the John Quincy Adams townhouse, stands another of Beantown's hotels, the Hotel Touraine. Enthusiastic applause is not an unusual sound in this area. We're in the heart of the theater district. Boston traditionally is one of the tryout cities for new productions. Their success or failure here is considered a barometer of potential runs on Broadway. Boston's continuous influx of visitors, as well as Bostonians themselves, have an almost unlimited wealth of entertainment facilities. Hundreds of thousands are devoted sport fans of our four major league teams: the Red Sox in baseball, Bruins in hockey, the Patriots in football, and the championship Boston Celtics in basketball. The hub has scores of nationally known restaurants, popular and art film motion picture theaters, legitimate theaters, and nightclubs to offer a wide variety of entertainments.
And as we enter Park Square and nearing the end of our tour of old historic Boston, here in the center of Park Square is the statuary entitled The Emancipation Group by Martin Milmore. It was given to the city by Moses Kimball in 1879. And as you'll note, it represents Abraham Lincoln in the act of freeing the slaves. Now, just off Park Square and dominating for many years the skyline of Boston is the Hotel Statler, or the Statler Hilton of today. The Statler is New England's largest commercial hotel at the moment, with close to 1,400 habitable rooms. Now, as we move toward Copley Square on St. James Street, Boston's largest structure, tallest building, is to our left front. The John Hancock Mutual Life Insurance Company building, it's 26 stories in height. On that 26th floor is an observation tower open to the public.
Up ahead we see Trinity Church and realize that our Gray Line tour of historic Boston is rapidly coming to an end. In a few moments, we'll be returning to Copley Square where our tour began. It's been a full circle. We've seen many wonderful, fascinating sights along the way. We've been treated to an intimate, close-up view of a city that has risen from the rugged roots of tradition to become the modern metropolis of the future. Before we say goodbye, our driver reminds us that the Gray Line offers tours to Boston and Cambridge, pointing out the educational facilities. A complete tour of Lexington and Concord, an evening tour to Salem and Marblehead, and a tour taking in Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and Maine. These are of special interest to lovers of scenic beauty who want to explore the fabled rock-bound coast of New England. Thank you very much for coming along with us on this Gray Line tour of historic Boston.